My dad raised his glass, smiled at his guests, and called me the only child he was embarrassed to introduce, while 100 people laughed like it was part of the entertainment, and I stood there in a navy dress I couldn't quite afford, holding a glass of cheap champagne, realizing in that exact moment that I had never truly had a place in my own family. He didn't just say I was uneducated, he said I was proof that even good parents could end up with a failure. And what hurt most wasn't the words. It was how easily everyone accepted them as truth. How my mother looked down at her plate, how my brother smirked into his whiskey, how my sister avoided my eyes like I was something shameful that had finally been exposed. And that was the night I understood something I should have learned years ago. I was never meant to belong there, and they were never meant to see who I really was. If this story speaks to your heart, only if this story truly resonates with you. Take a second to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, along with your local time, because I used to feel like I was the only one living a moment like this, and maybe you have too. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 31 years old, and that night at my dad's retirement party was the moment everything in my family broke beyond repair and forced me to become someone they never imagined I could be. But to understand how I got there, you have to go back to where it all really started. Long before the champagne glasses, the speeches, and the quiet humiliation dressed up as a joke. I grew up in a house where success was not just expected, it was measured, displayed, and compared like trophies on a shelf. And somehow I was always the one piece that never seemed to belong. My brother Daniel had his acceptance letter to Johns Hopkins framed above the fireplace before he even graduated high school. My sister Lauren had already interned at a law firm by the time she was 20, and every dinner felt like a quiet performance, where their achievements were recited in detail, while mine were either skipped or reduced to a polite silence that said more than words ever could. I remember one night when I was 19, sitting at the long oak table my dad loved so much, the kind that could seat 12, even though it was usually just the 5 of us, and he asked Daniel about his medical school interviews, then turned to Lauren to ask about her latest case study, and when his eyes finally landed on me, there was this pause. Like he was searching for something worth asking, something worth acknowledging, but instead he just said, "And you are still figuring things out, right?" And everyone nodded like that was a completely acceptable summary of who I was. I told myself back then that it did not bother me, that people took different paths, that I would find mine eventually, but the truth was, it settled into me slowly, like a quiet weight I could never put down, because it was not just that I had left college after 2 years, it was that in my father's eyes, leaving meant failing, and failing meant you no longer had a voice in the room. He never yelled, never caused a scene, which somehow made it worse, because his disappointment was always delivered calmly, almost professionally, like a verdict that had already been decided long before I even had a chance to explain myself. I tried different jobs in those early years, working at a small retail store, then a coffee shop off Maple Avenue where I learned how to remember regular customers' orders before they even spoke. Then a short stint at a local startup where I thought maybe, just maybe, I had found something that felt right. But every time I mentioned any of it at home, it was met with the same polite smile, the same distant nod, the same unspoken message that none of it really counted. My mother would say things like, "As long as you are happy," but she never said it with conviction. More like she was trying to convince herself as much as me, and my father would simply change the subject, steering the conversation back to something measurable, something impressive, something that fit the narrative he understood. The hardest part was not the words they said. It was the way they stopped asking about me altogether, like they had quietly decided there was nothing left to discover, and over time I started to shrink in that house, speaking less, sharing less, until I became exactly what they believed I was, someone with no clear direction, no real value, just drifting on the edges of a family that had already defined success in a way I did not fit. But what none of them knew, what none of them even thought to ask, was that I had not stopped moving forward. I had just stopped doing it in ways they could see, because while they were measuring worth in degrees and titles, I was learning something different, something quieter, something that did not need their approval to grow, and I kept that part of my life to myself, not out of shame, but because somewhere deep down, I realized that if they could not see me at my lowest, they did not deserve to see me when I finally found my way, and that realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, moment by moment, dinner by dinner, until one day I stopped trying to prove anything to them at all. And that was the beginning of everything changing, even if no one else noticed it yet. And I did not know it then, but every quiet step I was taking away from their expectations was leading me straight to the moment that would change all of our lives forever. There was a moment, somewhere between those quiet dinners and the day I stopped explaining myself, when I realized I was living two completely different lives, one that my family could see and one that they could not. And the strange part was the invisible one, was the only one that felt real. It started small, almost accidental, during my time at that local startup where I was technically just helping with customer support, answering emails, fixing minor issues, doing the kind of work no one ever notices. But I began to pay attention to patterns, to the way people used the product, to what frustrated them, and what made them stay. And instead of just forwarding problems to someone else, I started solving them on my own, staying late after everyone left, teaching myself things I had never learned in school, watching tutorials, reading forums, testing ideas over and over again until something finally worked. And for the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside me, not because anyone praised me, because no one did, but because I knew I was getting better at something that actually mattered. Eventually, one of my suggestions ended up being implemented quietly, without my name attached to it, and a few weeks later, the company's user engagement numbers went up, and I remember staring at the report on my screen, realizing that something I had built, something no one even knew I was capable of, was now affecting thousands of people. And that feeling, that quiet, undeniable proof that I was not what my family believed, became addictive in the best possible way. I started taking on freelance work under a different name, small projects at first, helping businesses fix problems they did not even know how to describe. And every time I completed one, I reinvested the money into learning more, building more, growing something that was entirely mine and completely separate from the version of me my family had already dismissed. I did not tell them about any of it, not when I landed my first major client, not when I worked through nights and weekends to deliver something I was proud of, not even when I realized I was earning more in a month than I used to make in half a year, because by then, it was no longer about proving them wrong. It was about protecting something that had finally become mine. At home, nothing changed. My father still introduced me to people as someone who was finding her way. My brother still spoke over me at dinner, like my opinions were optional, and my sister still offered polite advice I never asked for, as if I was a project that needed fixing. And I let them believe all of it. I let them hold on to that version of me because it made what I was building feel even more powerful, like a secret I was not ready to share. But there were moments, small cracks in the routine, where I could feel the tension building, like the night my father casually mentioned his upcoming retirement party, describing it as a celebration of everything he had achieved, everything he had built. And I remember sitting there, listening to him talk about legacy, about pride, about the importance of leaving something meaningful behind. And for a second, just a second, I almost told him the truth. I almost said, "You have no idea what I have been building. You have no idea who I am becoming." But I stopped myself because something inside me knew that moment was not meant to happen at a dinner table where no one was really listening. Instead, I just nodded, smiled, and asked what time the party would start. And he answered without hesitation, without even looking at me. Like I was just another guest, he expected to show up and blend into the background. And that was when it became clear to me that the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually was had grown so wide that it could no longer stay hidden forever. And I did not know exactly how or when it would happen, but I could feel it. Something was coming, something that would force everything into the open. And when that moment arrived, there would be no going back to the version of me they had always been so comfortable ignoring. The night of the party arrived faster than I expected, like everything that matters tends to. And I remember standing in my apartment staring at my reflection longer than usual, not because I was unsure of how I looked, but because I was aware, in a quiet and steady way, that I was about to walk into a room where no one truly knew me. And for the first time, that thought did not make me feel small. It made me feel calm. I chose a simple navy dress, nothing flashy, and nothing that would draw attention, because I had learned that the less people expect from you, the more powerful it is when you finally show them who you are. And as I slipped on my heels and grabbed my coat, My phone lit up with a message that had been sitting there for hours. One I had already read more than once. "Everything is ready whenever you are." And I did not reply, not yet. Because this moment was not about what was waiting for me outside that house. It was about what I was walking into. The venue was a country club about 20 minutes from my parents' house. The kind of place with polished wood floors, soft lighting, and walls lined with framed photographs of people who looked like they had always belonged there. And as I stepped inside, I could already hear the low hum of conversation, glasses clinking, laughter rising and falling in waves, and for a second, I paused near the entrance, taking it all in, because I knew once I walked further in, I would be stepping back into a role I had spent years quietly leaving behind. My mother spotted me first. Of course she did. She always noticed appearances before anything else, and she gave me a quick once-over, her eyes lingering just long enough to register approval without saying it out loud. And then she smiled in that careful way she had perfected over the years, the kind of smile that looked warm but never quite reached her eyes. "You made it," she said, as if there had been any doubt, and I nodded, leaning in for a brief hug that felt more like a formality than anything else. My brother Daniel was standing nearby, already halfway through a drink, talking to one of my father's former colleagues about hospital staffing shortages, and when he noticed me, he gave a small nod, the kind you give to someone you recognize but do not feel the need to engage with, and went right back to his conversation without missing a beat. Lauren, my sister, approached a moment later, her heels clicking softly against the floor, her posture perfect as always, and she gave me a quick hug, followed by a comment about how "it is good you came tonight," as if my presence was somehow surprising or optional. And I smiled, because that was what I had learned to do, smile, and let them believe whatever version of me made them most comfortable. My father was across the room, surrounded by people, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, fully in his element, and for a moment, I watched him from a distance, noticing how easily he moved through the crowd, how confident he looked, how certain he was of his place in that room, and I realized that this night, this celebration, was everything he valued most: recognition, respect, legacy, all of it wrapped up in one carefully planned event, and I understood then why what was about to happen would matter so much. As the evening went on, I blended into the background exactly as expected, making small talk with relatives I barely saw, listening to stories I had heard before, nodding politely at jokes that were not particularly funny, and all the while, I could feel that quiet awareness building inside me again, the same one that had been growing for years, reminding me that none of this defined me anymore. At one point, I stepped outside onto the terrace, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the warmth inside, and I looked out over the golf course, the lights stretching across the neatly trimmed grass, and I took a slow breath, steady and controlled, because I knew the moment was getting closer. I could feel it in the rhythm of the night, in the way people were gradually gathering near the center of the room, in the subtle shift from casual conversation to something more structured, more formal. When I walked back inside, the room had begun to settle, conversations quieting as my father made his way toward the front, a microphone already waiting for him, and I moved toward the edge of the crowd, positioning myself where I could see everything clearly without being the focus of anyone's attention. And as he took the microphone, adjusting it slightly, clearing his throat in that familiar way, I felt something settle inside me. Not fear, not anger, but something sharper, something clearer, like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. He began with the usual remarks, thanking his colleagues, reminiscing about his career, sharing stories that made people laugh and nod in recognition, and for a while, everything unfolded exactly as expected. Predictable, controlled, safe, and then, slowly, almost casually, he shifted, his tone lightening as he started talking about his family, about his children, and I could feel it before it happened. That subtle change in the air, that moment where something crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed, and I stood there, holding my glass, waiting, because deep down, I already knew this was the moment everything would finally break open. He smiled as he said their names. Daniel first, of course, talking about his career like it was something the entire room should admire. Then Lauren, listing her achievements with a kind of pride that filled the space effortlessly, and people nodded along, some even clapping softly, And I stood there watching it unfold exactly the way it always had, predictable, familiar, almost rehearsed. And for a brief moment I wondered if maybe tonight would be different, if maybe he would stop there, if maybe he would let the silence fall naturally, instead of filling it with something else, something unnecessary. But then he paused, just long enough to make people lean in slightly, just long enough to turn it into a moment, and then he said my name. There was a shift in the room, subtle but real, like people were not sure what to expect, because I had never really been part of these kinds of speeches before, not in any meaningful way, and I felt every eye turn toward me, even before I looked up, and when I did, I saw it clearly. Curiosity, mild confusion, a few polite smiles, all waiting for something they assumed would be light, harmless, maybe even kind. And, for a split second, I allowed myself to believe that too. He chuckled softly, adjusting the microphone again, and said, "And then there is Emily," like I was an afterthought, like I was the part of the story that did not quite fit. And a few people in the crowd smiled, expecting a joke, and that was exactly what he gave them, except it was not really a joke, not for me. He said, "Emily has always been different," drawing the word out just enough to make it land, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not because I had never heard it before, but because of where I was standing, because of how many people were listening, because of how easily he turned something personal into something public, and then he continued, his tone light, almost amused. She never quite followed the same path as the rest of us, and there were a few quiet laughs, the kind that people give when they think they are supposed to, and I kept my expression steady, my hand wrapped around the stem of my glass, grounding myself in something solid. But he did not stop there, and that was the moment everything shifted from uncomfortable to undeniable, because he leaned slightly closer to the microphone and said, "In fact, she is probably the only one of my children who managed to prove that even with every opportunity, you can still end up uneducated and, well, let us just say, not exactly driven." And this time the laughter was louder, more confident, because he had made it clear that this was acceptable, that this was part of the performance, and I heard someone near me let out a short laugh before quickly trying to cover it, as if they suddenly realized it might not be appropriate. But by then it was too late. The moment had already settled into the room. I glanced at my mother, hoping for something, anything, a reaction, a sign that she would step in or at least look uncomfortable, but she was staring down at her hands, her expression carefully neutral, like she had decided long ago that silence was easier than confrontation. And Daniel did not even try to hide his smirk this time, while Lauren pressed her lips together in that way she did when she wanted to appear sympathetic without actually doing anything. And in that instant, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not just about my father, this was about all of them, about the roles they had accepted, about the version of me they had agreed upon without ever asking if it was true. The room felt smaller somehow, the air heavier, but at the same time, everything inside me became very still, very focused, because I realized I had reached a point where I could either shrink again, laugh it off, let it pass like I always had, or I could do something different, something that would break the pattern once and for all. He was still talking, adding another light comment, something about how he hoped I would figure things out someday, and people chuckled again, softer this time, more cautious, and I let him finish. I let the laughter fade. I let the silence return, because timing mattered, and when it finally did, when the room settled into that brief pause between one moment and the next, I lifted my glass slowly, not in defiance, not in anger, but with a calm that even surprised me, and I smiled, the same kind of smile I had practiced for years, the kind that revealed nothing and everything at the same time. And as I looked directly at him, holding that moment just long enough for people to notice, I spoke clearly, my voice steady. "You are right," I said, and a few people shifted, unsure of where this was going, and I took a small breath before continuing. "This is the last time you will ever see me like this." And there was a ripple through the room, subtle but unmistakable, because something about the way I said it did not sound like a joke, did not sound like a reaction, it sounded like a decision. And for the first time that night, my father's expression changed, just slightly, just enough to show that he was no longer completely certain of what was happening. And I lowered my glass, still smiling, because what came next was not something I needed to explain, not yet, And as the room slowly tried to recover, as people glanced at each other, unsure of how to respond, I felt that same quiet certainty settle into place again, stronger than ever, because I knew this moment, this exact moment, was the beginning of something none of them were prepared for. For a few seconds after I spoke, no one moved, no one laughed, no one even seemed to breathe the same way they had before, and that silence felt louder than anything my father had just said, because it was no longer his moment. It was something else entirely, something no one in that room had expected. My father gave a short, uncertain chuckle, the kind people use when they are trying to pull control back into their hands, and he tapped the microphone lightly, as if resetting the tone, saying something about how I had always had a sense of humor, but it did not land the same way this time, because the energy had shifted. People could feel it even if they did not understand it yet, and I saw it in the way a few of his colleagues exchanged quick glances, in the way the laughter did not fully return. I did not stay to explain myself. I did not add anything more, because I knew that anything I said beyond that would weaken the moment, so instead, I took a small sip from my glass, set it down on the nearest table, and stepped back into the crowd as if nothing unusual had happened, letting the room slowly absorb what had just taken place. My mother approached me first, of course she did, her steps quick but controlled, her expression tight with that familiar mix of concern and quiet disapproval, and she leaned in just enough to keep her voice low, asking, "What was that supposed to mean?" And I met her eyes calmly, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady, and said, "It means exactly what it sounded like." And for a moment she looked at me like she was trying to find the version of me she understood, the one who would soften, who would explain, who would make things easier for everyone else. But that version was not there anymore, and I could see that realization unsettled her more than anything I had said. Daniel came over next, drink still in hand, his tone half amused, half dismissive, like he was trying to reduce the entire moment into something insignificant, something he could categorize and move past. "You really picked tonight for that?" he said, shaking his head slightly, and I noticed the way he did not actually ask what I meant, because in his mind, it did not matter. I was still the same person he had always known, still predictable, still beneath any real consideration, and I just looked at him for a second before saying, "You will understand soon enough," and that seemed to bother him more than if I had argued, because uncertainty was not something he was used to. Lauren hovered nearby, not quite stepping in, not quite staying out, her expression carefully composed as always, and she finally said, "Emily, if this is about something, you can just talk to us. You do not have to make a scene." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly aligned with everything I had come to expect. The assumption that any disruption must come from me being emotional, from me overreacting, from me needing guidance, and I shook my head slightly, keeping my voice even. "I am not making a scene," I said. "I am just done being part of one," and that was the closest I came to explaining anything that night. Across the room, my father had already moved on, continuing his speech as if nothing had happened, his voice steady again, his posture confident, and I realized that, for him, this moment would not fully register until later, until something forced him to revisit it, to question it, to understand it in a way he could not ignore, and that was exactly how I wanted, because this was not about confronting him in that room. This was about setting something in motion that could not be undone. As the evening continued, the conversation slowly picked back up, people returning to their drinks, their small talk, their comfortable patterns, but there was an undercurrent now, something subtle but present, and I could feel it in the way a few people glanced at me differently, not with pity, not with dismissal, but with curiosity, like they had sensed that there was more to the story than they had been told. I stayed just long enough to let the night settle, to let my absence later feel intentional rather than reactive, and when I finally made my way toward the exit, no one stopped me. No one asked where I was going, because in their minds, I was simply leaving early, just another small, forgettable detail in a night centered around someone else, and that was exactly what made it so powerful, because they did not realize that this time, when I walked out of that room, I was not coming back as the person they thought I was. Outside, the air was cooler, quieter, the sounds of the party fading as the door closed behind me, and I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around me, feeling something shift in a way I could not fully put into words. Not relief, Not satisfaction, but something deeper, something final, like closing a chapter that had been dragging on far longer than it should have. My phone buzzed again, the same message thread still open, still waiting, and this time I did not hesitate. I typed a single response, "It is time." And as I walked toward my car, the parking lot lights casting long shadows across the pavement, I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. Not just for me, but for all of them. And the part they still did not understand, the part they would only realize later, was that I had not said those words lightly. I had not made a dramatic statement for attention. I had made a promise, and I intended to keep it. The drive home felt quieter than it should have, like the world outside my windshield was moving at a normal pace, while something inside me had completely shifted into a different rhythm, and I kept replaying the moment in my head, not the words my father said, but the way the room reacted when I answered him, that subtle pause, that flicker of uncertainty that had never existed before, and for the first time, I realized that control does not always come from speaking louder. Sometimes it comes from saying just enough and letting everything else unfold on its own. When I pulled into my apartment parking lot, the clock on my dashboard read 10:42 p.m., and I sat there for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, taking in the stillness, because this place, this small, quiet apartment, was the only space in my life where I had ever been fully seen, even if no one else knew it. And as I stepped inside, kicking off my heels near the door, the familiar hum of my laptop on the desk greeted me like an old friend, steady, reliable, unchanged by anything that had happened that night. I walked over, set my phone down, and opened the screen, and there it was. Everything I had built, everything I had protected, dashboards filled with numbers that told a story no one in my family had ever bothered to ask about, client accounts that depended on systems I had designed, messages waiting for decisions only I could make. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting it all sink in, because this world, this version of me, was not something I had imagined. It was something I had created piece by piece, while they were busy deciding I was not worth their attention. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call, and I answered without hesitation, placing it on speaker as I moved toward the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water like it was any other night, even though it was anything but. Did it happen? A voice asked on the other end, calm, professional, someone who knew exactly what tonight meant without needing an explanation, and I took a small sip before answering, yes, keeping my tone steady. It is done. And there was a brief pause, not of uncertainty, but of acknowledgement, like a line had just been crossed, that could not be uncrossed. Then we move forward, the voice replied, and I nodded, even though they could not see me, because that was the only direction left, forward, into something that had been in motion long before that party, long before that speech, long before anyone in my family had decided who I was supposed to be. Over the next hour, I moved through a series of small, deliberate actions, confirming details, reviewing timelines, making sure everything was aligned exactly the way it needed to be, and there was no rush, no panic, just a quiet precision that came from knowing I had prepared for this moment for years, not days, not weeks, but years of building something that no one could take away from me because no one had even realized it existed. Sometime after midnight, I finally sat down, the room dim except for the soft glow of the screen, and I allowed myself to think about them again, about my father standing at the front of that room, confident, certain, completely unaware that the narrative he had relied on for so long was about to collapse under its own weight, about my mother trying to keep everything smooth, everything presentable, about Daniel and Lauren, so comfortable in their roles that they had never considered the possibility that those roles might change. And I did not feel anger when I thought about them, not anymore. What I felt was something far more distant, something like clarity, because I understood now that their perception of me had never actually been about me. It had been about what fit into their version of the world, and I had simply stopped trying to fit. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had to, but because something inside me was already moving, already anticipating what was coming next. And as I made coffee, standing by the window watching the early light stretch across the buildings outside, I felt that same steady calm from the night before, the same sense that everything was unfolding exactly the way it was meant to, even if no one else could see it yet. My phone had a few missed messages from my family, short, vague, nothing urgent, nothing that suggested they truly understood what had happened, just small attempts to maintain normalcy, to keep everything within the boundaries they were used to, and I did not respond, not because I was avoiding them, but because I knew that whatever came next would speak louder than anything I could say in a message. By the time the clock reached 9 a.m., everything was in motion, emails scheduled, announcements prepared, meetings aligned, and I sat back in my chair, taking one last look at the screen in front of me, because this was the moment where preparation turned into reality, where something that had been hidden for so long was about to become impossible to ignore. And as I reached for my phone, not to check messages, not to respond, but to watch what was about to unfold, I realized something that made me smile slightly. Not out of satisfaction, but out of certainty. They still thought last night was the story. They still believed that moment in that room was the peak of everything, and they had no idea that it was only the beginning. At exactly 9 a.m., nothing looked different on the surface. The city outside my window moved the same way it always did, cars passing, people walking, the ordinary rhythm of a morning that gave no indication that something significant was about to unfold. And that was what made it feel even more surreal, because the biggest changes in my life had never announced themselves loudly. They had always arrived quietly, almost invisibly, until suddenly they were impossible to ignore. I sat at my desk, my coffee untouched beside me, watching the screen as the first scheduled email was sent out, not to one person, not to a small group, but to an entire network that had taken years to build, a network my family did not even know existed, and within seconds, I saw the responses begin to appear, confirmations, acknowledgments, messages that reflected a level of respect and recognition I had never once received in that house growing up. I did not rush to read them all. I did not need to, because this was not about validation in the way it used to be. This was about alignment, about everything I had worked toward finally moving forward in a way that could no longer be contained. My phone buzzed shortly after, not with a message this time, but with a call from a number I recognized immediately, and I answered calmly, already knowing what it was about. "It is live," the voice on the other end said, and I nodded, glancing back at my screen where the announcement had just gone public. The official statement, the company name, my name, all of it laid out clearly in a way that left no room for interpretation, and for a moment, I allowed myself to take it in, not as something unbelievable, but as something inevitable, because this had never been a sudden success. It had been a long, quiet process that had finally reached a point where it could not stay hidden anymore. Across the country, people were reading it, reacting to it, sharing it, and among them, somewhere not too far from where I sat, were the same people who had stood in that room the night before, the same people who had laughed, who had nodded, who had accepted a version of me that no longer existed. And I wondered briefly what it looked like from their perspective, how the narrative shifted in real time as new information replaced old assumptions. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message, and then another, and another, the notifications stacking quickly enough that I did not even need to open them to know where they were coming from, because there was a pattern to it, a rhythm I recognized, the sudden urgency, the shift from silence to attention, from dismissal to curiosity, and I let them sit there for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because I understood something now that I had not understood before, that timing was not just about when you speak, it was about when you choose to listen. Eventually, I picked up the phone and opened the first message, my mother's name at the top, her words short, almost careful, asking if I had seen something online, asking if it was really me, and I could almost hear the uncertainty behind the text, the way her usual composure had been disrupted by something she could not immediately categorize, and I read it without responding, moving to the next message, Daniel's this time, less restrained, more direct, asking what was going on, how this had happened, why no one knew, and there it was, not concern, not support, but confusion mixed with something else, something closer to disbelief, like the foundation he had always relied on had suddenly shifted. Lauren's message followed, more measured, more controlled, asking if we could talk, saying that if there was something I had been working on, I should have shared it with the family, And I paused on that one a little longer, not because it affected me, but because it revealed exactly what I had already come to understand, that even now, even with everything laid out in front of them, their instinct was still to frame it in a way that centered their expectations, their involvement, their version of how things should have been. I set the phone down again, leaning back in my chair, and let out a slow breath, not because I felt overwhelmed, but because I could feel the shift happening, not just externally, but internally as well, the final separation between who I had been in that house and who I had become outside of it. The next call came a few minutes later, and this time I knew I would answer, not because I needed to explain anything, but because I was ready for them to hear my voice in a way they never had before. And when I picked up, I could hear it immediately, the difference in tone, the hesitation, the lack of certainty. "Emily?" my father's voice said, and it was the first time in a long time that he sounded unsure of something. And I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of emotion, but out of recognition, because this was the moment I had been moving toward. Not the speech, not the party, but this, the point where the narrative he had held on to no longer matched reality. And when I spoke, my voice was calm, steady, unchanged by any of it. "Yes," I said. And for a moment, there was silence on the other end. The kind of silence that carries weight, that signals a shift that cannot be undone. And I knew, without needing him to say anything else, that everything had already changed, even if he had not yet found the words to acknowledge it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind that stretches just enough to make you aware that something has shifted but not yet settled, and I could almost picture him standing there, phone in hand, trying to reconcile the version of me he had held onto for years, with the information now in front of him. And for the first time in my life, I was not the one waiting for his response. He was waiting for mine. "I saw the announcement," he finally said, his voice slower than usual, more measured, like he was choosing each word carefully, and I did not answer right away. Not because I was unsure, but because I understood that silence had a way of making people reveal more than they intended. And after a second, he continued, "Is it true?" And there it was, not disbelief exactly, but a question that carried something deeper, something closer to uncertainty about everything he thought he knew. I leaned back slightly in my chair, my gaze resting on the window as I answered, "Yes," keeping it simple, letting the weight of that single word do what it needed to do, and I could hear him exhale softly, not in relief, not in frustration, but in something I had never heard from him before, something like recalibration. You started this?" he asked, and I could almost hear the shift happening in real time, the slow adjustment from dismissal to recognition, and I nodded even though he could not see me. "I built it," I said, my voice steady, not defensive, not proud, just factual. And there was another pause, longer this time, as if he needed a moment to process what that actually meant. In the background, I could hear faint voices, my mother's, my brother's, overlapping slightly, asking questions, trying to piece things together, and it struck me how different it felt now, how their voices, which once carried so much weight in my decisions, now sounded distant, almost separate from the space I was in. "Why did you not tell us?" he asked finally, and that question, more than anything else, made something inside me settle completely, because it revealed that even now, his perspective had not fully shifted. He was still trying to understand my choices through the lens of his expectations, and I let a small breath out before answering, "Because every time I tried to tell you anything before, you had already decided what it meant." And I did not say it with anger. I did not raise my voice. I just stated it the way it was, and that seemed to land harder than anything else I could have said. There was no immediate response, no attempt to interrupt or correct me, just silence. And I realized that this was the first real conversation we had ever had, not because of what was being said, but because of what was not. There were no assumptions filling the gaps, no quick judgments, just the reality of a moment neither of us could control. "Emily," he said after a while, and there was something different in the way he said my name this time, less certainty, more intention, like he was trying to reach me rather than define me. I did not know, and I closed my eyes briefly. Not because the words affected me the way they might have before, but because I understood something important in that moment, that his not knowing had never been about a lack of information. It had been about a lack of willingness to see, I know, I replied, and for a second I considered saying more, explaining, filling the space with details that would make everything clearer, but I stopped myself, because clarity was no longer something I needed to provide. It was something they would have to find on their own. In the background, Daniel's voice became louder, asking what I said, asking what was going on, and my father lowered his voice slightly, stepping away from them, creating a small separation that had never existed before. And I noticed that. I noticed the way he was, for the first time, choosing to speak to me without an audience. This is significant, he said, and I could hear the effort in his tone, the attempt to find the right words in a situation where his usual ones no longer applied. And I almost smiled at that, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition, because this was new for him, just like it had been new for me years ago when I first stepped into something I did not fully understand yet. It is, I said, and I kept it at that because I did not need to elaborate. The details were already out there, already moving through the world in ways that did not require my explanation. Another pause followed, shorter this time, but still present, and then he said something I had not expected, not because of the words themselves, but because of how they sounded coming from him. We should talk. And for a moment, I let that sit, not rushing to agree, not rejecting it either, just acknowledging it as what it was, an opening, something that had never been offered before in a way that felt genuine. I turned slightly in my chair, looking at the screen again, at the steady flow of updates, the confirmation that everything was continuing to move forward exactly as planned, and I realized that whatever conversation came next would not change that, would not redefine it, because this part of my life was no longer connected to their approval. We can, I said finally, my tone even, not distant, but not eager either, just balanced, and that seemed to settle something on his end, even if only slightly. As the call came to a close, there was no dramatic resolution, no sudden understanding, just a quiet acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed between us, something that could not be undone or ignored. And when I set my phone down, I did not feel the need to check for more messages right away. I did not feel the urgency that used to come with their attention, because I knew now that whatever they thought, whatever they said, whatever they tried to understand, it was all happening after the fact, after the decision had already been made, after the path had already been chosen, and for the first time in my life, I was not waiting for them to catch up. I was simply moving forward, exactly as I had planned all along. By the time the afternoon settled in, the shift had already spread further than I expected, not in a loud or chaotic way, but in a steady, undeniable ripple that reached places my family had always considered stable and predictable, and I began to see just how interconnected everything really was, how the quiet work I had been doing in isolation was now intersecting directly with the world they understood. I noticed it first through a forwarded message, one of many that had started circulating, but this one stood out because of the name attached to it, a senior partner from the firm where Lauren worked, someone whose opinion carried weight in her world, and the message was simple, almost casual, congratulating her on being related to that Emily Carter, as if the connection itself had suddenly become something noteworthy, something valuable. And I paused for a moment, reading it again, not because I needed to, but because it captured something I had anticipated but never fully imagined, the way recognition shifts perception almost instantly, the way the same name, the same person, can carry completely different meaning depending on context. My phone rang again, and this time it was Lauren, not a message, not a delayed response, but a direct call, and I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be intentional about how I stepped into this conversation. And when I picked up, her voice came through quickly, controlled but noticeably different from the night before. "Emily, I think we need to talk." And I could hear the urgency beneath her composure, the kind that comes when something no longer fits into the framework you have relied on for years. "We can talk," I said, keeping my tone even, and there was a brief pause before she continued. "I did not realize. I did not know you were involved in something at this level." And I almost smiled at that phrasing, because it still carried the assumption that involvement was something granted, something assigned, rather than something built. But I did not correct her. I did not need to. "There was a lot you did not know," I replied, not as a criticism, just as a fact, and she let out a small breath on the other end, like she was adjusting to a conversation that was no longer unfolding the way she expected. "You could have told us," she said, echoing the same sentiment my father had expressed earlier, and I leaned back slightly, looking at the ceiling for a moment as I answered, "Would it have changed anything?" And that question seemed to land in a way that required more than a quick response, because there was a silence that followed, not defensive, not dismissive, just uncertain, and that uncertainty was something I had rarely seen in her before. "That is not fair," she said eventually, her tone softer now, less certain, and I nodded slightly, even though she could not see me. "Maybe not," I said, "but it is honest," and for a moment neither of us spoke, the weight of that honesty settling into the space between us. Across the city, in offices and conference rooms, in emails and conversations I was not directly part of, my name was continuing to move, to attach itself to ideas, to projects, to decisions that carried real impact, and I could see it reflected in the updates coming through on my screen, the confirmations, the new inquiries, the subtle but clear shift from introduction to recognition. And I realized that this was the part no one ever sees when they judge from the outside. The years of quiet work that suddenly appear overnight as something unexpected, something surprising, when in reality it was anything but. Later that day, another call came through, this time from Daniel, and his tone was different from both my father and Lauren, less measured, more direct, but not in the dismissive way I was used to. There was something else there now, something closer to frustration mixed with curiosity. "So, you have just been doing this all this time?" he asked, and I could hear the disbelief in his voice, not because he thought I was incapable, but because he had never considered the possibility. "Yes," I said simply, and he let out a short breath, like he was trying to process a puzzle that no longer made sense. "Why would you keep it from us?" he asked. And again, the same question, the same underlying assumption, and I found myself answering it the same way, not with emotion, but with clarity. "Because every time I showed you who I was, you told me who I was instead." And there was a pause after that, longer than before, because this time, it was not just information they were processing, it was perspective. "That is not," he started, then stopped, as if the words he was about to use no longer fit, and I did not fill the silence for him. I let it remain, because sometimes people need that space to realize something on their own. As the day moved forward, the conversations continued, each one slightly different, each one revealing a new layer of how my family was adjusting, not just to what I had done, but to what it meant about everything they thought they knew. And through all of it, I remained the same, calm, steady, not because I was trying to prove anything, but because I no longer needed to. By early evening, I received a message from my father again, shorter this time, more direct, asking if I would be willing to meet in person, and I read it carefully, not because I was unsure of my answer, but because I understood the significance of the request. This was not about control anymore. This was about acknowledgement, and I set the phone down for a moment, considering it, not from a place of obligation, but from a place of choice, because for the first time, that was what it was, a choice. And as I looked around my apartment, at the life I had built without their approval, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever was said in that meeting, it would not define me, it would not limit me. It would simply be another step in a story that I was now fully in control of, and that was something no one could take away from me. The next morning felt different in a way that was impossible to ignore, not because anything around me had changed, but because I knew that by the end of the day, something long overdue would finally be said out loud, something that had been building quietly for years without ever being acknowledged. I agreed to meet my father at a small cafe about 10 minutes from his house, a place we had been to a few times before, but never for anything important, never for a conversation that actually mattered. And as I walked in, I saw him already sitting at a table near the window, his posture straight, his hands folded in front of him, looking like he had arrived early and spent that extra time thinking, which in itself was unusual. He stood up when he saw me, not in the automatic, confident way I was used to, but slower, more deliberate, like he was unsure of how to begin, and that hesitation told me more than any words could have. "Emily," he said, and there was no performance in his voice this time, no audience, no expectation, just my name, and I nodded, taking a seat across from him, noticing how the space between us felt different, not tense exactly, but unfamiliar, like we were meeting each other for the first time without the roles we had always played. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence stretched just enough to make it clear that this was not going to follow the usual pattern. There would be no quick comments, no easy assumptions, just whatever truth we were willing to face. "I read everything," he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, and I nodded again, waiting, not because I needed him to continue, but because I wanted him to choose his words without being guided by me. "I did not know," he repeated, and this time it sounded different from the day before, less like an explanation and more like an acknowledgement, and I leaned back slightly, studying his expression, trying to understand what had shifted, because something clearly had. "You did not ask," I said calmly, not as an accusation, just as a fact, and he nodded almost immediately, which caught me off guard, because I had expected some resistance, some attempt to explain, but instead, he just accepted it. "You are right," he said, and those 3 words, simple as they were, carried more weight than anything he had ever said to me before. The server came by to take our order, breaking the moment briefly, and we both asked for coffee, the same thing, which felt oddly symbolic in a way I could not quite explain, and as she walked away, the silence returned, but it was different now, less uncertain, more reflective. "I thought I understood what mattered," he said after a moment, looking down at his hands. "Education, discipline, direction. Those were the things I built my life on, and I listened, not interrupting, because for once, this was not about me explaining myself. It was about him examining his own perspective. And when you left school," he continued, "I decided what that meant." And he paused, his eyes lifting to meet mine. "I did not give you the chance to show me anything else." And there it was, the part that had always been missing, not just an acknowledgement of what happened, but an understanding of why it mattered. And I felt something shift inside me, not forgiveness exactly, but a release, like something I had been carrying without realizing it was finally set down. "I stopped trying to show you," I said quietly, and he nodded again, slower this time, like he was processing not just the words, but everything behind them. "I see that now," he said, and there was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to correct or justify, just a recognition that felt genuine, and that alone changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Our coffee arrived, and for a few seconds, we focused on something simple, something neutral, the act of stirring sugar, of adjusting cups on the table, and it gave both of us a moment to absorb what had already been said before moving forward. "What you have built," he said eventually, "it is impressive." And I noticed the slight hesitation before the last word, not because he did not believe it, but because he was not used to saying it about me, and I appreciated that he said it anyway, even if it was unfamiliar. "Thank you," I replied, keeping my tone even, because while the words mattered, they were not what defined this moment. What mattered was that he was seeing something he had never allowed himself to see before. "I was wrong," he added, and this time there was no hesitation, no pause, just a clear, direct statement. And I held his gaze for a second, letting that settle, because those words were not something he gave easily, not to anyone, and certainly not to me. "You were," I said softly, not to diminish him, but to meet him where he was now, in a space where honesty was finally possible. He let out a small breath, almost like a release, and leaned back slightly, his posture relaxing in a way I had never seen before, like he was no longer trying to hold on to something that had already slipped away. "I do not expect you to forget what I said," he continued, his voice steady but quieter, "or how I treated you." And I nodded, because that was true. Those things did not just disappear. They stayed. They shaped you. They became part of the story whether you wanted them to or not. "But I would like the chance to know you now," he said. And that sentence, more than anything else, defined the moment, because it was not about the past. It was about what came next. About whether something new could exist where something old had already broken. I looked at him for a moment, considering it, not from a place of obligation, not because he was my father, but because I had the choice now, and that made all the difference. And after a second, I nodded, not as a full answer, not as a resolution, but as an opening, because sometimes that is where real change begins. Not in a single moment of forgiveness or understanding, but in the decision to allow something different to exist where it never had before. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that conversation. It did not transform into something effortless or completely healed, but it became something far more valuable, something steady, something honest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living in a way that actually belonged to me. The weeks that followed were quieter, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that mattered was finally aligned. My work continued to grow in ways I had only once imagined, opportunities expanding, decisions becoming clearer, and each day felt less like something I had to prove and more like something I was simply building with intention, without the weight of needing approval attached to it. My relationship with my family changed too, not overnight and not completely, but in ways that felt real. Conversations became slower, more thoughtful. My father listened more than he spoke, which was something I had never experienced before. And while there were still moments where old patterns tried to return, they no longer defined the space between us, because I had learned something that changed everything. I no longer needed them to see me in order to see myself. And that, more than anything else, was what set me free. Not the recognition, not the success, but the understanding that my value had never been something they had the authority to define in the first place. For a long time, I believed that if I just worked harder, if I just proved enough, if I just became something they could understand, then everything would fall into place. But the truth was, the moment everything changed was the moment I stopped asking for permission to be who I already was. And if you are listening to this right now, if you have ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or quietly dismissed by the people who were supposed to know you best, I want you to understand something. Your worth does not shrink just because someone else cannot see it, and your path does not become less valid just because it looks different from theirs. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is keep building, quietly, consistently, until one day you realize you are no longer waiting to be recognized. You are simply living your truth. Thank you for staying with me through this story, truly, because sharing something like this is not about going back, it is about moving forward. And if even a small part of this resonated with you, then maybe you are not as alone as you thought. I would love to know, have you ever had a moment where you finally chose yourself, even when it meant stepping away from what others expected of you? And if this story spoke to your heart, only if it truly resonated with you, you can gently like and subscribe. But more than anything, just remember that your story is yours to define. Emily Carter, 31, and the lesson I want to leave with you is your worth is not decided by those who fail to see it.